Nobody expected it to be just 2 words. No press conference. No long caption. No carefully polished statement run through PR teams and league filters. Just 2 words, dropped instantly, that ended up exposing more about the WNBA than months of debates, interviews, and media arguments ever could. Caitlin Clark lands one of the most prestigious opportunities any basketball player, man or woman, can get while still actively playing. NBC brings her onto their flagship NBA coverage, placing her alongside Hall of Famers and legends of the game. It's the kind of move that instantly changes how the world views an athlete. And yet, when the news broke, something strange happened. The league went quiet. Veterans who usually have a lot to say suddenly had nothing. Media voices who love to contextualize success avoided the topic entirely. Social timelines filled with celebration from fans, analysts, and NBA circles. But from inside the WNBA itself, there was an awkward silence that felt impossible to ignore. And then Aaliyah Boston reacted. Not with jealousy. Not with passive-aggressive shade. Not with a carefully worded comment designed to avoid backlash. Just 2 words that said everything the rest of the league wouldn't. That moment didn't just support Caitlin Clark. It exposed insecurity, ego politics, and a culture problem that's been quietly holding the league back for years. And to understand why that reaction mattered so much, you first have to understand what Caitlin Clark actually walked into with NBC, because this wasn't just another nice opportunity. When people hear that Caitlin Clark is joining NBC as an NBA analyst, some assume it's a symbolic gesture, a publicity move, a feel-good crossover moment meant to generate headlines and buzz. That assumption couldn't be more wrong. NBC doesn't hand out seats on its flagship NBA broadcasts as favors. This isn't a casual guest appearance tucked into a quiet studio show. This is basketball night in America, one of the most visible stages the sport has. The audience isn't niche. The expectations aren't soft. And the people sitting next to her aren't there because of hype. They're there because they've earned credibility over decades. Caitlin Clark is stepping into a space normally reserved for retired legends, not active players, especially not players from outside the NBA ecosystem. That alone makes this historic. But what really makes it uncomfortable for some people is what it signals. NBC didn't just invite Caitlin because she's popular. They brought her in because they believe she can analyze the game, communicate it clearly, and hold her own next to names like Carmelo Anthony, Tracy McGrady, and Vince Carter without shrinking. Networks don't take risks on live television. If Caitlin struggled, it wouldn't just reflect on her, it would reflect on the network. The fact that NBC is confident enough to put her in that chair tells you everything about how they view her basketball mind. And here's the part that rarely gets said out loud. This isn't validation from women's basketball. This is validation from the highest level of basketball media, period. The NBA side of the sport isn't afraid to say what the WNBA often dances around. Caitlin Clark isn't just a star within her league. She's one of the most recognizable, bankable, and knowledgeable figures in basketball right now. That's why she keeps getting invited into spaces that historically never opened their doors to WNBA players. Golf events, national commercials, NBA broadcasts. Other leagues aren't hesitant to embrace her. They don't downplay it. They don't qualify it. They don't worry about who might feel threatened. They just acknowledge reality. And that's exactly why this NBC deal landed so hard. Because while the rest of the basketball world saw it as a natural step for a generational figure, parts of the WNBA saw it as something else entirely. A reminder that one player is being recognized in ways others never were, and maybe never will be. That kind of recognition forces uncomfortable questions. Why her? Why now? Why does she keep crossing boundaries that were supposedly closed? Those questions make people defensive. And when defensiveness sets in, silence often follows. Which is why what didn't happen after this announcement matters, just as much as what did. Because while Caitlin Clark was being celebrated on the biggest stages in basketball, many of the people who share her league chose to say nothing at all. And that silence set the stage for one reaction that completely flipped the narrative. But that part of the story comes next. When Caitlin Clark's NBC deal became public, there was no shortage of reaction across the basketball world. NBA analysts praised it. Fans celebrated it. Media outlets framed it as historic. But inside the WNBA, that's where things got uncomfortable. Because what followed wasn't outrage or congratulations, it was absence. Timelines that are usually filled with commentary suddenly felt empty. Voices that never miss a chance to weigh in on league conversations went completely still. No reposts. No shoutouts. No happy for her, messages tucked into captions. Just quiet. And in professional sports, silence is rarely accidental. This wasn't one or two players choosing not to comment. It was a noticeable pattern, especially among veterans who've spent the last 2 seasons openly debating Caitlin Clark's impact on the league. These same players had no problem speaking up when the conversation centered around pay disputes, attention imbalance, or media narratives. But when Caitlin crossed into NBA media territory and earned recognition on one of basketball's biggest stages, the energy shifted. That's because moments like this force people to confront something they've been trying to avoid. It's one thing to argue about hype during a rookie season. It's another thing to watch a player earn institutional validation from outside the league. This NBC deal wasn't about scoring averages or ticket sales. It wasn't even about popularity. It was about credibility. Caitlin wasn't being discussed. She was being trusted. Trusted to represent the game. Trusted to speak to millions. Trusted to sit next to legends and not look out of place. And that kind of trust hits differently. For years, certain veterans have framed Caitlin's rise as something inflated by media obsession. They've implied that her success is manufactured, that opportunities come too easily, that attention isn't earned evenly. But when a network like NBC makes a move like this, that argument gets harder to maintain. Because NBC doesn't operate on feelings. They operate on numbers, influence, and expertise. So instead of celebrating, many chose to disengage. Some masked it with vague posts about staying focused. Others leaned into unrelated conversations. A few slipped passive-aggressive comments into interviews about opportunity and fairness without naming names. And then there were those who said absolutely nothing at all. That silence wasn't neutral. It was protective. Protective of ego. Protective of a narrative that's been carefully built over the last 2 years. One where Caitlin's success is something to be questioned rather than embraced. Because if you acknowledge that this deal is deserved, you also have to acknowledge that the league hasn't always supported its most valuable asset the way it should have. And that's a tough thing to admit. What makes this even more revealing is that moments like these usually unify leagues. When an athlete breaks barriers, teammates and peers typically rally around it, even if there's quiet competition behind the scenes. That's how most professional environments operate. Public support, private motivation. But this wasn't that. This was avoidance. And avoidance only happens when people feel exposed. Exposed to comparison. Exposed to hierarchy. Exposed to the reality that basketball doesn't reward everyone equally. It rewards those who move the needle. The uncomfortable truth is that Caitlin Clark's rise has forced a reckoning the WNBA still hasn't fully accepted. She didn't just bring attention. She changed expectations. She changed who gets invited into elite spaces. And she changed how the outside world views women's basketball, even if parts of the league resent how that happened. That resentment doesn't always show up as anger. Sometimes it shows up as distance, as indifference, as pretending something monumental didn't just happen, which is why what happened next mattered so much. Because while most people chose silence, one person didn't hesitate. She didn't calculate. She didn't worry about how it would be perceived. She reacted instantly. And in doing so, shattered the entire narrative. And that reaction came from someone who had every reason to feel a different way. Aaliyah Boston didn't wait. She didn't sit back to see how the rest of the league would respond. She didn't check the temperature of social media. She didn't run anything through a PR lens or frame it with disclaimers. The news dropped, and almost immediately, her reaction followed. 2 words. 1 emoji. No explanation. And somehow, it landed louder than every silent timeline combined. In an era where athletes are trained to over-explain, soften, and qualify every public statement, Aliyah did the opposite. She kept it short, decisive, and unmistakably supportive. No ambiguity. No room for misinterpretation. It wasn't a strategic post. It was instinctive. That's why it mattered. Because anyone can write a carefully crafted message after the dust settles. Anyone can support something once it's universally accepted. But reacting instantly, without hesitation, tells you exactly how someone really feels. And Aaliyah Boston felt proud. That 2-word response didn't just congratulate Caitlin Clark. It shut down an entire narrative that's been circulating inside the league. That supporting Caitlyn somehow comes at the expense of your own status. That celebrating her success means diminishing your own achievements. Aaliyah made it clear that wasn't how she saw it. What made the moment even more powerful was how subtle it was. She didn't call anyone out. She didn't criticize the silence. She didn't frame herself as morally superior. She simply showed what real support looks like without turning it into a performance. And fans noticed immediately. Because in a league where reactions are often filtered through insecurity or competition, authenticity stands out. That post didn't feel like optics, it felt real. It felt like someone who wasn't threatened, wasn't jealous, and wasn't worried about being compared. It felt like confidence. And confidence in professional sports is rare when attention is unevenly distributed. Aaliyah didn't need to prove anything. She didn't need to remind anyone of her resume. She didn't need to protect her image. Her reaction came from a place of security. Security in her role, her talent, and her value. That's why it resonated so strongly. Because everyone understands the unspoken context. Everyone knows how often Caitlyn's success has been questioned. Everyone knows how frequently other players have danced around acknowledging it. So when Aaliyah stepped forward so naturally, it highlighted how unnatural the rest of the league's silence felt. It wasn't loud, but it was definitive, and the timing made it impossible to ignore. This wasn't a quiet off-season moment. This was Caitlyn Clark joining one of the biggest platforms in basketball. A moment that, under normal circumstances, would unite players across the league in celebration. Instead, it became a mirror, showing who was comfortable with her rise and who clearly wasn't. Aaliyah's reaction also carried weight because of who she is within the league. She isn't a fringe player. She isn't someone fighting for relevance. She's a cornerstone, a former #1 pick, a consistent all-star, a face of her franchise. If anyone had the credibility to feel slighted, to feel overshadowed, or to quietly pull back, it was her. And yet, she chose to lean in. That choice didn't just reflect her character. It raised questions about everyone else's. Because if Aaliyah Boston can celebrate Caitlyn Clark without hesitation, what does it say about those who couldn't? That question lingered. And it only got heavier when you looked at the season Aaliyah had just come through. Because if there was ever a moment where resentment would have been understandable, it was then. And that context changes everything. If Aaliyah Boston had wanted to feel a certain way, nobody could have blamed her. The 2025 season put her in a position most stars quietly resent. Expectations shifted overnight. The pressure multiplied. The safety net disappeared. And suddenly, the responsibility of carrying an entire franchise landed squarely on her shoulders. Caitlyn Clark, the player the offense was supposed to revolve around, wasn't there. Injuries don't just remove production. They remove rhythm, chemistry, and identity. When Caitlyn went down, the Indiana Fever didn't just lose points, they lost gravity. Defenses no longer had to stretch the floor the same way. The spacing collapsed. The burden moved inward, straight onto Aaliyah. Night after night, she became the focal point. Not in the glamorous way that gets highlighted on national segments, but in the grinding, physical, thankless way that defines interior dominance. More touches, more double teams, more defensive attention, more expectations to stabilize a team dealing with chaos. And she answered. She didn't miss games. She didn't hide. She didn't disappear when things got uncomfortable. She showed up every night, absorbed the punishment, and kept the Fever competitive in a season that easily could have spiraled. That's the part that matters. Because this is usually where resentment grows. This is where players start doing quiet math in their heads. Who's getting the spotlight? Who's taking the hits? Who's being talked about? And who's doing the work? Those thoughts don't always turn into public criticism, but they don't just disappear either. Especially when the player sidelined by injury continues to land major opportunities. That's a dynamic that breaks locker rooms. One star grinding through the season, another making headlines in the off-season. It's the perfect recipe for bitterness, even among the most professional athletes. History is filled with examples of partnerships that cracked under far less strain. And Aaliyah had every reason to feel that strain. She didn't just carry the scoring load. She anchored the defense. She became the emotional stabilizer. She fielded the questions. She absorbed the frustration. And she did it without knowing when, or if things would ease up. That kind of responsibility changes people. It hardens some. It isolates others. And in leagues where attention is already uneven, it often leads to quiet resentment that eventually leaks out in interviews, posts, or subtle jabs. But Aaliyah didn't crack. Instead of turning inward, she leaned into leadership. Instead of questioning why Caitlyn's name kept dominating headlines, she focused on doing what the team needed. Instead of allowing circumstances to divide them, she kept the partnership intact. That's what makes her reaction to the NBC deal so revealing. Because support like that doesn't come from obligation, it comes from perspective. Aaliyah understood something many players struggle to accept. Success isn't always symmetrical. Impact isn't always evenly rewarded. And just because someone else is getting opportunities doesn't mean yours are being taken away. She could have looked at the situation and thought, I'm the one holding this together. She could have quietly distanced herself. She could have chosen neutrality. Instead, she chose enthusiasm. That choice wasn't naive. It was intentional. It showed emotional maturity and a long-term view that most athletes don't reach until much later in their careers. And that's why her reaction landed so differently. Because when you understand what she had just endured, her support for Caitlin Clark stops being a small gesture and starts looking like a statement. A statement about confidence, a statement about leadership, and a statement about what kind of culture she believes in. And once you recognize that, it becomes impossible not to ask the next question. Why did she respond this way, when so many others in her position wouldn't have? That answer reveals even more about her mindset and the league itself. Professional sports don't reward fairness. They reward impact. That's a truth every athlete learns eventually, but not everyone accepts it the same way. For some, it becomes a source of motivation. For others, it turns into quiet frustration that never really goes away. Aaliyah Boston has lived long enough in this league to understand that difference. She knows that attention gravitates toward flash. She knows that scoring from the logo attracts cameras in ways post-play never will. She knows that narratives don't always reflect effort or responsibility. And she knows that when one player becomes the face of something bigger than the sport itself, comparisons become unavoidable. That's exactly why her reaction matters. Because if anyone had a legitimate reason to feel overshadowed, it was her. She did the work that doesn't go viral. She carried the burden that doesn't trend. She played through a season where the margin for error was razor thin. And yet, when Caitlin Clark crossed another milestone, Aaliyah didn't frame it as imbalance. She framed it as progress. That mindset doesn't come from naivety. It comes from security. Aaliyah knows who she is as a player. She knows what she brings to the floor. She knows her value doesn't depend on likes, segments, or mentions. That self-assurance allows her to celebrate someone else's success without interpreting it as a threat. That's where many others struggle. In a league where opportunity has historically been limited, success can feel scarce. When one player receives disproportionate attention, others instinctively fear being left behind. That fear turns into comparison. Comparison turns into resentment. And resentment quietly shapes behavior. Aaliyah broke that cycle. Instead of seeing Caitlin's NBC deal as something that highlighted inequality, she saw it as something that expanded the ceiling for everyone. Because once one door opens, it becomes harder to keep others closed. That perspective separates leaders from competitors. Leaders understand that visibility is contagious. When one player breaks through, it raises expectations across the board. It changes how networks view the league. It changes how sponsors invest. It changes what's possible. Competitors trapped in insecurity don't see that. They see a zero-sum game. They believe attention given to someone else is attention taken from them. And that belief slowly erodes collaboration. Aaliyah didn't fall into that trap. Her reaction suggested something deeper. She understands that Caitlin's success doesn't erase her own. It complements it. It strengthens the foundation they're both standing on. That's a rare level of clarity in an environment fueled by comparison. And it directly exposes the insecurity behind much of the league's silence. Because if celebrating Caitlin Clark feels difficult, it's not because the achievement isn't impressive. It's because acknowledging it forces people to confront uncomfortable truths about hierarchy, influence, and value. Aaliyah didn't shy away from that confrontation. She met it head-on, and did so effortlessly. That effortlessness is what made her reaction feel authentic. No bitterness. No qualifiers. No undercutting. Just confidence. And confidence like that doesn't just affect how fans perceive you. It shapes how organizations build around you. Because when a franchise sees two stars who genuinely support each other instead of competing for validation, it changes everything about the future. And that future for the Indiana Fever now rests squarely on this partnership, which makes what comes next even more important. The most revealing part of Caitlin Clark's NBC deal wasn't the announcement itself. It was who celebrated it, and who clearly didn't know how to react. Because outside the WNBA bubble, there was no confusion. NBA media embraced the move instantly. Analysts spoke about her basketball IQ without hesitation. Networks treated her presence as obvious, not controversial. There was no tiptoeing, no qualifying language, no awkward framing. Just acknowledgement. And that contrast exposed something the WNBA has been struggling with for years. The league has never fully figured out how to handle a star who is bigger than the system itself. Caitlin Clark didn't just arrive as another talented player. She arrived as a cultural force. She brought audiences that weren't already invested. She pulled in casual fans, neutral fans, and even skeptics. She didn't ask permission. She didn't fit neatly into existing hierarchies. And she didn't wait her turn. That disrupts people. Because sports leagues like control. They like slow progression. They like narratives that can be evenly distributed and carefully managed. Caitlin shattered that structure simply by being undeniable. And instead of leaning into that momentum, parts of the league responded with discomfort. You could hear it in the way conversations shifted. Praise became conditional. Achievements were contextualized. Success was framed as media-driven instead of performance-driven. The conversation stopped being about basketball and started being about fairness. That's where things went sideways. Because fairness and impact aren't the same thing. The NBA understands this. That's why they don't hesitate to center stars who move the needle. They don't pretend every player carries equal weight. They don't dilute recognition to protect egos. They let reality dictate attention. The WNBA, on the other hand, often tries to flatten excellence. And Caitlin Clark broke that illusion. Her NBC deal forced a truth into the open. When basketball institutions outside the league look at women's basketball, they don't see it as evenly distributed. They see standouts. They see voices worth amplifying. And right now, Caitlin is at the center of that. Aaliyah Boston's reaction quietly acknowledged that reality. By celebrating Caitlin without hesitation, she aligned herself with progress rather than insecurity. She didn't pretend the moment wasn't significant. She didn't downplay it. She didn't try to rebalance the narrative. She let it be what it was. And that's what made it powerful. Because by doing so, she exposed how unnatural the league's discomfort has become. When celebrating a historic moment feels controversial, the problem isn't the moment, it's the environment. Aliyah understood that Caitlin's success wasn't an indictment of anyone else. It was proof that the ceiling for women's basketball is higher than it's ever been. But not everyone is ready to accept that. For some, Caitlin's rise threatens the idea that success should be evenly shared. For others, it forces uncomfortable comparisons. And for a few, it highlights opportunities they never received and may never get. Those feelings are human. But when they shape public behavior, they become limiting. Aliyah refused to be limited. Instead of shrinking the moment, she expanded it. Instead of treating Caitlin's success as a problem to manage, she treated it as something to be proud of. And that decision doesn't just reflect personal character. It signals what kind of culture she believes in. A culture that rewards excellence. A culture that welcomes visibility. A culture that understands growth doesn't happen by pretending stars don't exist. And once you see it through that lens, one thing becomes very clear. Aaliyah Boston wasn't just supporting a teammate. She was choosing the future over the past. And that choice has consequences, not just for perception, but for what comes next for the Indiana Fever and the league as a whole. Aaliyah Boston understands something that too many people in the league either ignore or actively resist. Visibility isn't a threat. It's leverage. When Caitlin Clark lands a high-profile NBC role, it doesn't just elevate her personal brand. It elevates the Indiana Fever, whether people want to admit it or not. The team stays in national conversations during the off-season. The franchise becomes more attractive to sponsors, free agents, and media partners. The spotlight doesn't narrow, it widens. Aliyah gets that. She's not thinking about one headline or one appearance. She's thinking about the ecosystem around her, about how attention compounds, about how momentum builds, about how relevance today shapes opportunity tomorrow. That's why her reaction wasn't cautious. It was confident, because she understands that being associated with greatness doesn't dilute your value, it amplifies it. When Caitlin is discussed on NBA broadcasts, Aaliyah's name is never far behind. When the Fever are mentioned in national conversations, both stars benefit. When the franchise is framed as a destination instead of an afterthought, doors open for everyone involved. This is where the mindset divide becomes obvious. Some players view success as a finite resource. They believe there's only so much attention to go around, so when one person gets more, everyone else loses. That belief turns teammates into competitors and milestones into threats. Aaliyah doesn't see it that way. She understands that leagues grow when stars are allowed to shine without being dimmed for the sake of balance. She understands that one breakthrough can create dozens of ripple effects. And she understands that trying to suppress momentum only hurts the sport in the long run. That perspective is rare and incredibly valuable. It's the difference between someone who reacts emotionally and someone who thinks structurally. Aaliyah isn't focused on how Caitlyn's success compares to her own. She's focused on how it changes the landscape they both operate in. And that kind of thinking separates winners from people who stay stuck. Because winners don't waste energy resenting teammates. They invest in alignment. They understand that shared success creates stronger foundations than isolated achievements ever could. Aaliyah's response wasn't just supportive, it was strategic, whether consciously or not. It signaled stability. It signaled unity. It signaled that the Fever aren't fractured by ego or hierarchy. And in a league where internal friction has become increasingly visible, that signal matters. It tells potential free agents that this is a place where stars can coexist. It tells sponsors that this is a market worth investing in. It tells fans that what they're watching isn't performative unity, it's real. That's why her 2 words carried so much weight. They weren't loud, but they were intentional. And they quietly set the Fever apart from the rest of the league. Because when your biggest stars understand that success is shared, not hoarded, you create something most teams never achieve. You create sustainability. And that sustainability is about to be tested, because the future of the franchise now rests squarely on this partnership. What happens next will determine whether this moment becomes a footnote or the foundation for something much bigger. The Indiana Fever aren't just rebuilding a roster. They're rebuilding an identity. And at the center of that identity sit 2 players who could not be more different in style, but could not be more aligned in mindset. Caitlin Clark and Aliyah Boston are the foundation. Not just because of talent, not just because of draft position, but because of how they interact when pressure is highest. One stretches the floor and warps defenses from the perimeter. The other controls space, anchors the paint, and stabilizes chaos. One brings spectacle. The other brings certainty. That balance is rare. What makes it even rarer is that there's no visible power struggle. No quiet tug-of-war over who the franchise belongs to. No competition for validation. No signs of ego-driven tension that so often derail teams built around multiple stars. Aliyah's reaction to the NBC deal confirmed that. Because moments like that are where cracks usually show. When one player gets national love, endorsement shine, and cross-league recognition, it often triggers insecurity, even if it never surfaces publicly. That's how partnerships fracture. Slowly, silently, and irreversibly. But that's not what's happening here. Instead, the Fever have 2 cornerstones who appear genuinely invested in each other's success. That's not just good chemistry, it's organizational gold. Teams spend years trying to manufacture that kind of alignment and still fail. The Fever didn't luck into it. They drafted character as much as talent. Aliyah understands that Caitlyn's spotlight doesn't overshadow her presence, it highlights it. Caitlyn understands that Aliyah's dominance inside makes everything she does on the perimeter more dangerous. Their games feed each other. Their success compounds. That's how real partnerships work. And the timing couldn't be more important. With so few players locked into the franchise long-term, the Fever's direction is still being written. Front offices pay attention to moments like these. They watch how stars respond to each other's success. They evaluate whether egos will clash or coexist. Aliyah passed that test without even realizing she was taking it. Her response didn't just resonate with fans. It reassured the organization that this pairing is stable. That pressure won't divide them. That success won't breed resentment. That adversity won't turn into blame. That kind of assurance shapes every decision that follows. Who they sign, how they market the team, how they present the franchise to the rest of the league. Because when your stars are aligned, everything else becomes easier. The Fever don't need to worry about managing personalities. They don't need to overcorrect narratives. They don't need to mediate conflict before it exists. They can focus on building around two players who trust each other and understand the bigger picture. That's a competitive advantage most teams never get. And it didn't come from a highlight or a stat line. It came from 2 words posted without hesitation. Words that told everyone watching that this partnership is real. And fans picked up on it immediately, because authenticity is impossible to fake. Which brings us to the reaction that mattered just as much as the league's silence. The fans saw something different, and they weren't quiet about it. The reaction from fans didn't take time to build. It was instant. As soon as Aaliyah Boston's post hit timelines, the contrast became impossible to ignore. While official voices hesitated and veteran reactions stayed muted, fans locked onto the moment with clarity the league itself seemed to lack. Because to fans, this wasn't complicated. They didn't see politics. They didn't see hierarchy. They didn't see ego management. They saw one star supporting another without conditions. And that felt refreshing in a space that's been dominated by tension for far too long. For years, fans have been pulled into debates that felt exhausting rather than inspiring. Conversations about who deserves attention. Arguments over who's being pushed versus who's being ignored. Endless framing that pits players against each other instead of celebrating the growth of the game itself. Aaliyah's reaction cut straight through that noise. Fans immediately recognized it as genuine because it didn't feel calculated. There was no brand-safe phrasing. No attempt to appeal to everyone. No balancing act between praise and deflection. It was clean. It was confident. And it felt honest. That honesty stood out because fans are tired of performative unity. They've seen too many moments where public support feels forced, delayed, or hollow. They know when something is being said because it's expected rather than felt. This wasn't that. The response online reflected that recognition. Comments didn't just praise Caitlyn, they praised Aliyah. They called her a real teammate. A real leader. Someone secure enough to celebrate without turning the moment into a comparison. And just as importantly, fans noticed who didn't say anything. Silence doesn't go unnoticed in the age of instant reaction. When a moment this big happens and familiar voices disappear, people draw their own conclusions. Fans don't need explanations, they understand patterns. They've watched the way Caitlyn Clark has been treated since entering the league. They've seen how praise is often followed by qualifiers. How achievements are met with hesitation. How excitement is dampened by debates about fairness instead of amplified by pride. So when Aliyah broke that pattern, it felt like a breath of fresh air. It reminded fans why they fell in love with sports in the first place. Not for the politics, not for the resentment, but for moments of shared joy and mutual respect. And that matters more than the league might realize. Because fan sentiment shapes narratives faster than official messaging ever could. When supporters rally around authenticity, it exposes how disconnected institutional behavior has become. It highlights the gap between what people want to see and what they're actually being given. Aliyah's reaction didn't just support Caitlyn, it aligned with the fans. And alignment with fans is power. It builds loyalty. It strengthens trust. It shifts perception. In that moment, Aliyah wasn't just a player reacting to news. She became a symbol of what fans wish the league would be more of: open, confident, and unafraid to celebrate excellence without conditions. That's why the moment stuck. And that's why the timing of it made everything even louder. Because this didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened during one of the most turbulent periods the league has faced in years. And that context changed everything. Aliyah Boston's reaction didn't happen during a calm, stable moment for the league. It happened in the middle of chaos. Contract uncertainty. Public disputes. Negotiation drama spilling into headlines. Players airing frustrations while fans watched the league's internal tension play out in real time. This was not a moment of unity, which is exactly why Aliyah's response hit so hard. While parts of the league were locked in conflict, arguing over money, recognition, and power, Caitlyn Clark was quietly elevating women's basketball in a way no meeting or protest ever could. She wasn't demanding attention. She wasn't calling anyone out. She was earning trust from institutions that historically ignored the league altogether. And Aliyah saw that for what it was. Not a distraction. Not a betrayal. Not an imbalance. An opportunity. Her support landed like a contrast shot. On one side, noise, resentment, and internal division. On the other, professionalism, momentum, and forward motion. Without saying a word about the chaos, Aliyah effectively chose which direction she believed in. And people noticed. Because timing reveals intent. She didn't wait until it was safe to show support. She didn't wait for public opinion to settle. She didn't hide behind neutrality while things played out. She reacted immediately, knowing full well how loaded the conversation around Caitlin Clark has become. That's what made it bold. In doing so, Aaliyah indirectly exposed the insecurity behind much of the backlash Caitlin has faced. If celebrating someone's success feels dangerous, it's usually because it threatens something fragile. Aaliyah clearly didn't feel threatened. She felt confident. Confident in her role. Confident in her value. Confident that Caitlin's rise doesn't erase her own. And that confidence made the rest of the league's discomfort stand out even more. Because while some players were busy protecting their position, Aaliyah was focused on progress. While others were stuck arguing over slices of a shrinking pie, she was thinking about how to make the pie bigger. That difference in mindset is everything. It's the difference between people who build and people who block. Between those who push the game forward and those who cling to old structures that no longer work. Aaliyah didn't just support Caitlin Clark. She exposed the gap between where the league is and where it needs to be. At face value, it was just a quick Instagram reaction. But in context, it was a statement. Aaliyah Boston didn't just congratulate her teammate. She modeled what professionalism looks like when ego is removed from the equation. She showed that you can be a star without needing to be the center of every story. She proved that real leadership doesn't require speeches, it requires clarity. Caitlin Clark's NBC deal wasn't controversial. The reaction to it was. And Aaliyah's response quietly separated confidence from insecurity, progress from resistance, and leadership from noise. The Indiana Fever didn't just draft two elite players. They drafted two people capable of building something sustainable together. Two stars who understand that shared success is more powerful than individual validation. That's rare. That's valuable. And that's how winning cultures are formed. If this partnership stays intact, the Fever's future isn't just bright, it's stable. And in a league searching for direction, that stability might be the most important thing of all. If you appreciate seeing professionalism win over jealousy, real leadership over insecurity, and teammates actually supporting each other, make sure you like this video and subscribe. This channel breaks down what's really happening in basketball, beyond the headlines and the noise. Drop a comment with your thoughts on the Fever's future with this duo, and we'll see you in the next one.